Welcome back to the Pilot's Lounge. On today's episode, we are joined by CW5 retired David G. Hill, who shares with us his multiple decades of aviation experience, both in the military and the civilian world. With over 12,500 flight hours and a multitude of type ratings in both rotary and fixed-wing aircraft, David's experience is absolutely invaluable, and we can't wait to share it with you. From wherever you're listening, sit back, grab your cup of coffee, and thanks again for joining us on the Pilot's Lounge. Welcome back to the Pilot's Lounge. On today's episode, we are joined by David Hill, a former Army aviator, retired Army aviator, and Chief Warrant Officer 5 with 3 decades plus of experience, continuing both from military into the civilian aviation industry. And we could go through listing all of his accolades and experience here in the intro, but we're going to dive into that because, quite frankly, it's just too extensive for me to try to read off all of the airframes and the amount of experience you have. But the big takeaway is there are 10 plus airframes and over 12,500 hours of flight experience. David, welcome. I'm super stoked to have you. And Spencer, I know you've been working to get this together, so it's really awesome to have you on the podcast today.
Nick, I'm pumped to be here. Thanks for the invite, and Spencer as well. Thank you guys, and happy Mardi Gras.
Happy Mardi Gras. Something that we always do here on the Pilot's Lounge, and I know before we started recording, Spencer kind of talked about it a little bit, is called Table Talk. You spent quite some time in Army aviation, and I know you know what that is in the traditional sense, with an IP sitting down with, or a PC for that matter, sitting down with a more junior or fellow pilot and asking each other questions. But here on the Pilot's Lounge, we usually just ask off-the-wall questions to get some creative juices flowing and just to get everybody comfortable. I know Spencer likely has been thinking of questions for over a week now, so I'm going to let him start this one off.
No, I had something that I really wanted to do, but I didn't. I'm going to not say it online, so I'll just go with the traditional ones. David, I know you appreciate an adult beverage every now and then. So in your many years of traveling and flying and places that you visited, what is one of your favorite watering holes or dive bars or whatever that you've been to?
Let's see. Well, my favorite drink naturally is a Jack and Coke. That's kind of my go-to drink. But I think there's a place that's probably closed now in New Orleans. I flew out of Jackson, Mississippi for a while, and it was a place when we would overnight there. The guys would just kind of hang out. It was called the Dungeon, kind of off of a back street off of Bourbon Street. Played some heavy music, and guys, we just used to go in there and have a sit down drink. So that was always a fun place.
The Dungeon in NOLA.
That sounds like it'd be pretty cool. I've never been to NOLA, but somewhere called the Dungeon in NOLA sounds like it'd be a good time.
Yeah.
So my question, and
of course, here in the Alabama area, sorry for the skip, sorry. The Floribama is hard to pass up here in Alabama as well. Neat place for anybody that if you haven't been there, you need to go. Put it on your bucket list.
That's probably the top of my list for sure. Many fun times. And across the street at the little yacht club that they have as well.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I love it. Now, my question is going to be, just because of the breadth of your experience in all of the aircraft that you have flown throughout your career, I'm going to narrow it down a little bit for a selection and just use the aircraft that you have type ratings in, or that you had listed your type ratings in, being out of the Falcon 2000, Lear 45, Hawker 800, Citation XLS Plus, Augusta 139, and Sikorsky S76, or, the UH-60 for all of us Army guys. What is your favorite aircraft that you have flown out of those, and why?
Yeah, I would have to say the Falcon 2000, Nick. It is I'll give the French credit. They build a superb airframe. Of course, it comes from the lineage from the Mirage jets and others that Dassault makes, the Dassault Falcon family. And it's just a fun aircraft to fly, very forgiving. For some of us that lack in skills, it's very forgiving. It's
familiar.
Yes. And the mission was fun too. I'm not as seasoned as an international captain. Many of the gentlemen that out there flying heavy iron, the Falcons, Gulfstreams, Bombardier products. But I've dabbled in it enough to fly to Europe and Japan and South America. And it's just a beautiful airframe to fly, a lot of fun. And it let me dabble into that experience and fly to Berlin, fly to London, fly to Italy, some places like that. So not only the airframe itself, the mission is pretty cool as well.
Absolutely. What is it? What's the typical, you're talking about some of these distances. What's the typical range on a Falcon 2000?
I flew the classic model and it was about 3,200 mile range. The newer versions are probably 3,800, maybe 4,000. And once you step up to the larger aircraft in the Dassault family, the 7X, or get into some of the Gulfstreams or Bombardier products, those airframes get 5,000, 6,000 miles real quick. And
that's
so
wild.
you can be stuck. Yeah, you can be stuck in the cockpit, 10, 12 hours at a time. And I'll say stuck. Usually have a crew that rotates in and out on those real long legs.
Awesome. Spencer, do you have the next one?
Yeah, I'm going to steal Brett's thunder here since he usually likes to ask a movie or TV related question. And David, this really isn't a question because we were just chatting about it the other day, but are you up to date on all the Masters of the Air episodes, or where are you at in that right now?
I've just watched one, but I will confess, I've watched it 3 times. So it's pretty cool. I loved it. So I don't want to get too far ahead of my lovely bride. So she's been busy. We hadn't been able to get together on that and watch it. So, but it's a just awesome show. Acting in it is great. And the B-17. And my dad was in World War II, not on the B-17. He was a mechanic on the B-26. So, it kind of puts a little different spin on it for me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, if you don't have anything else, I think that little comment about his dad in World War II might be a great segue into just the traditional meat and potatoes of the episode. And
absolutely. Yeah. I was thinking kind of the same thing. And David, I know you gave us a little bit of your synopsis and your background prior to the episode, but I want to kind of wind things way back to your childhood. Talk a little bit about, where you grew up, the culture, especially with your dad being a World War II veteran in the aviation community, kind of what your upbringing was like and what got you into aviation.
Yeah, Nick, I grew up in a little town called Tallulah, Louisiana. It's a northeast part of the state. Ironic that Delta Airlines actually started there. So Delta Airlines started in Tallulah, Louisiana as a crop dusting service. Then probably in 1928 or so, give or take a little, they moved to Monroe, Louisiana and became a mail carrier. But that's where Delta Airlines started, hence the Delta Airlines. And so a lot of aviation buffs from that area. I grew up, there was a crop duster. His name was Merle Gustafson, did air shows all around the United States, but a lot in the Southeast United States. He had a Corsair and a T6. And in fact, his Steve Gustafson is still famous on the air show circuit. He flies at Oshkosh. He flies one of the T6s in the North American team. They do some really amazing stuff with those airframes. So anyway, aviation's always kind of been in my blood. Started out when I was young. So
that's awesome. And kind of coming up, did you know that you wanted to be a pilot, or was it something that just kind of interested you?
Well, I have a little story I'll tell you. It takes about 2 or 3 minutes, but it is an interesting story. And I'll have to give you a little bit of history. When I was young, my mother and father actually divorced when I was about 3, 4, 5 years old. And I went to live with my grandmother. My mother and father got back together, and so it was a happy ending to that story. But needless to say, my grandmother was a big influence on me growing up. And she was the type, a Southern Baptist. If the church doors were open, she was there. So she had her Bible, and it was a very active Bible. She would take notes in it, scribble in it. And so when she passed away years ago, I have 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. Everybody knew I would get my grandmother's Bible. So years pass. I was in my 40s. So it was well after she had passed away. And one Sunday afternoon, sitting around kind of minding my own business, and I said, I'm going to look at her Bible and just kind of go through it. So I'm going through her Bible, and she has notes in there from when my brother was in the 4-H in the 5th grade, all these kind of cool stories. And, like Reverend Smith did a sermon today on such and such. And so I was going through the Bible, and I came to a little, and she put newspaper clippings from funeral services and weddings. It was a working man's Bible, so to speak. So I came upon this piece of paper, and it was folded in half. And on the outside, it said, drawn by David. And she put the date on there. Of course, I was about 5 or 6 years old. And I opened it up, and it was a flight of helicopters, looked like Hueys flying in formation. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I teared up, and I'm just like, what in the world? So, and she had written a note in there. And so I had seen probably Walter Cronkite or something in the Vietnam War. Of course, it was a big deal, mid 60s, 65 or so. And it just blew me away. I called my wife up and I boohooed and all that good stuff, but I put it right back where my grandmother had it in that Bible, and it's there today. But, I went through 35 years of my life and never saw that until after she passed. I just thought that was amazing. So evidently there was something there. I don't believe in, maybe not divine intervention, but evidently I had the bug at an early age, Nick.
That's super interesting too in hindsight, and only so because, growing up myself, I was around fixed wing. I never really thought that I wanted to be a helicopter pilot until later. And it's funny because I was part of, I'm sure you've probably heard of Civil Air Patrol before. I did that growing up. Well,
oh, sure.
When I was about 13 years old, 13 or so, a flight of Army Black Hawk medevac helicopters came, and I had forgotten about this experience until I was years later when I was already in flight school. And I remember I went back to my parents for Christmas, and I came across this photo of, me at 13. And it was just like one of those things. I didn't think anything about it at the time. They came in, we got to take pictures with this aircraft and everything. And it was just, in this album. And that was the first time I'd ever even seen a military helicopter, let alone be up next to it. And it's funny because, years and years later, that ended up coming to fruition as what was my future. And I think that, maybe those things subconsciously stay with us, even though we may not recognize it throughout our decision-making processes in life. But, I'd love to know a little bit more, coming up through your teenage years, what really made you decide to pull the trigger, especially too, because when you came into the service, the landscape of the world was very different and the conflicts of the world were very different. And I'd love to know a little bit about your perspective and what made you join.
Yeah, I graduated high school in 1975, and without a lot of direction. I came from a very, very rural, very, just farmland. And if it was a little town that, if you had money, it was okay. If you didn't, it was going to be a tough way. So I said, maybe the military is going to be a good approach for me. So not having a college degree, I went in, I was always mechanically inclined, tinkering with cars and everything else. So I went in as a helicopter mechanic. And later went to Army Flight School as a warrant. But I just had the bug and I had a cousin who was in the Air Force years before that, talked to him a little bit about it. And, for a young country boy from Louisiana, it was a good avenue for me, to pursue a career, learn a trade as well. I was thinking of it as that as well. Not so much the passion was there, but also I said, I've got to make a living in my life, so I might as well learn a skill. So that's what drove me in that direction, Nick.
What airframes did you work on, David, when you were a Tango?
I was, back then, the MOSs were 67s and 68 MOSs. So I actually went to Fort Eustis as a airframe mechanic, but went to Fort Bragg, and they were shorthanded 67 Novembers, which is the same as the 15 series now. So I went in and got my secondary MOS as a 67 November, which is a Huey crew chief. And of course, this is 76, 77, 78, 79. Still, there was a lot of guys from Vietnam there. A lot of the pilots I flew with, so flying in formation, I was sitting in the back of this Huey, flying around Fort Bragg with Sicily drop zone and 9 Meg and all these drop zones. And And these guys are, big flights of, 20, 30 helicopters, the air assaults. And it was just too cool. These guys would put the rotor blades over the tail rotor of the aircraft in front of you. They were that good. And it was just like, holy smoke. So I did observe a lot, but being a mechanic as well, occasionally I would get to go out and I had my fixed wing license. I had a private license and did a little flying on the side, flew airplanes, little 150s and 172s, and knew I wanted to go to flight school. So most of the pilots knew that. So if there was a maintenance flight, I would get to wiggle the sticks a little bit, because back then the maintenance officer, you could fly the Huey single pilot. So I would get in and get an opportunity to be exposed to it. It made flight school a little easier when I got there, because I understood a little bit of that. But that's, Fort Bragg was a cool place to be as a 18, 19, 20-year-old kid. Vietnam, as they called it, too. Man. It was a lot of fun. In fact, one of my best friends today is one of my roommates that we roomed together in the late 1970s. So friendships go a long way. Yeah, I talk to him every week.
I would have loved to have known what
cool.
Simmons Army Airfield was like back then. It's probably actually not all that different. I don't think they've done anything to the airfield since then, but it is interesting that you say that, because especially it's very relatable to me, having also come up in my early 20s in that community. And I think especially Fort Bragg being the epicenter, or now, Fort Freedom, whatever they're calling it now, being the epicenter for all of the different communities that exist there. I'd love to know a little bit more about, maybe one or two experiences that you would consider really shaped you as a young adult, maybe even as a crew chief before going to flight school, that, made it click and said, like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to flight school.
Yeah, this was, it was a cool place to be. Let me circle back to a couple of things there, a couple of nuggets. We wore the 18th Airborne Corps patch. We were a Corps asset. 12th Aviation was a group. In 1979, they moved the 12th Aviation group to Germany. And so they moved many of the assets. We went over to the 82nd Aviation Battalion. We were the 119th Aviation, called the Red Hawks, and that was lineage from Vietnam. I remember being on CQ, pulling duty at night and reading in the old papers from 1969, 1970, what was going on in Vietnam. It's so cool to read those stories. So we did a lot of cool things, and this was pre-160th. So we picked up a lot of those missions. We flew the SF school around. We did, Stabo training with those guys. And here I am, 19, 20 years old, in the back of a Huey, getting a chance to do this. It was probably 78, 79, somewhere in that area, that there was a gentleman by the name of Colonel Charlie Beckwith, if you've ever heard of him. He started Delta Force, but back then there was some competition between an organization they were starting called Blue Light and an organization called Delta Force. And we would go out and fly those guys around. And of course, I'm a helicopter mechanic. I understand my role there, but being able to be around them and do the air assaults with them and fast roping and, all the, rappelling. And it was just too cool. We would land and they would have to have interpreters work, because some of the guys were from Germany. Some of the guys, I assumed they were Israeli, but, this was probably not too many years after, the Olympic massacre. And so Colonel Beckwith was trying to build a force that could respond to that. So I thought that was just the neatest thing to be able to see him. He was the alpha dog too. He was maybe a full colonel by then, maybe a lieutenant colonel, but he was out there with his troops, and they were nothing short of badass. They were the precursors to Delta, and I was just blown away by those guys for sure.
I have to make a plug, because I wanted to hear a little bit about it, only because I knew you were at Bragg and I was curious who you were with. I don't know if you can see in the background. The Red Hawks eventually became Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion of the 82nd
yes.
in the assault, which that was where I went directly out of flight school and spent about 6 years with. And so it's
awesome.
It's crazy because, we have the history, there are lineage books there. Right. And
yeah.
it's cool hearing it from, I don't want to say the horse's mouth, but from somebody who was there when all of that was
a different time
coming around. It's really cool. And there's definitely still some pieces, or were some pieces several years ago there that existed. I'm very sure they existed in the late 70s and 80s, but no, that's awesome. So coming out of flight school, or actually we can kind of talk a little bit about flight school itself. I'm sure, and Spencer, feel free to chime in. I know I tend to ramble, but just to kind of talk a little bit about flight school, because I know obviously flight school went through its phases, and I'm sure it had already moved. I'm sure it had been at Rucker for quite some time by the time that you had gotten there, but
correct.
But what was your flight school experience like? Was it still where you were a warrant officer candidate throughout the entirety of flight school? Do you mind talking a little bit about your experience?
Absolutely. It was called WOC-D, Warrant Officer Candidate Dash Development. And we were actually in the old World War II barracks. And let's see, some other unique things that are different today. Oh, you didn't get promoted to W1 until you graduated flight school. So you went, again, a year or so compared to guys now. And that's fine. I'm glad for them. They get paid more. Their time and grade, time and service, all those things, adds up for them. So I'm proud for them. But it was just an era that, we went around as WOCs. You were different colors. So you started out, and then you would go to I think the seniors wore an orange tab, and it was just a different time. It was a lot of, we all call it harassment, but there was a lot every day, it was like basic training, 365. When you got to be a senior, it wasn't too bad. But WOC-D was a pretty cool experience. In fact, you'd be standing in formation, and if a helicopter flew over, you couldn't look at it. They would drop you if you, if you even looked up. You'll never fly that thing, So we had some great instructors, but a little different back then. I think the camaraderie has probably failed a little bit, because I still keep in touch with a lot of the guys that I went to flight school with. There's a Facebook page. We've gotten together at conventions, HAI convention or conference. So I think you miss a lot of that, but it is what it is,
I do. I think it's definitely different, and I think there are pockets of that. I think it's very much, and I can't speak for how it is right now. Obviously, I'm a decade separated from flight school at this point. However, I do think that so obviously the social media era is great for that. But I think the community as a whole, and really as a testament to what Spencer and Brett and Kyle founded with Brotalion, was to bring a lot of that camaraderie and pride in what we do back. Because I think your generation, probably the generation after yours, and some of the guys that were in the initial invasion generation of aviators, they definitely had it. And I think that's changed a little bit, but that's a different tangent. So you're in flight school, you're a WOC. Now, from my understanding, and this could have been still prior to this time frame, but of course we all hear legends and stories about the things that happened at Fort Rucker and in the olden days, I'll say. Now, back then, was that the time frame where you could go fly, like you could basically go take a helicopter out and fly it, or was it at that point phased like a very structured program?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was still structured. I started out in the TH-55, and I've shared this story with Spencer before, because we're all there together in nice little cliques. The solo day was a big deal, and the TH-55 in the civilian market, it had a regular engine without a governor. For the military, they put a governor on it, which is nothing more than a piston that would kick the throttle back if you started to overspeed it. So you'd sit there to hover, and it would wiggle and wobble, but people would come in on final, and you lower the collective down, and if you don't reduce the throttle, it was a manual throttle back then. If you didn't reduce the throttle, it would overspeed, and George, it's what we call the governor, George would kick in and make the helicopter spin. So we were actually there one day, and we're all, it's a big day because you're soloing. And so your buddy gets out, the instructor gets out, and your buddy goes around. And sure enough, we're there, and we see a friend of ours coming in who happened to have a good bit of fixed wing time in his civilian world. And he comes in, and you see George kicking, and the tail's kicking left and right, like, this is not good. Everybody kind of crunches down in the stadium. Had the bleachers there, and everybody's crunching down like, I don't know how this is going to end well. And sure enough, he comes in, and he hits the ground probably 1,000 feet a minute, pretty good little rate of descent, kicks back up in the air, spins around twice and lands back. Skids are spread, breaks the tail boom off. The tail rotor's sitting there spinning. The main rotor's stopped, and everybody, all the fire trucks and all go out to him, and, they kind of dust him off. And the next day he was back in flying with us. So it was an interesting time, but we truly soloed. And, it was how we didn't run into each other. I'd never know, because of all the IPs and initial points and all we had to make. It was a fun time. And then we did get a chance to what we called solo in the Huey when you first got in those, but you were with another student.
Right.
So that was always kind of cool. That was a big step. Those were two big steps in your progression. And everybody went through instruments in the Huey, and then you would go to your particular track. So you would track, if you tracked utility, you would stay in the Huey and then go to Black Hawk after graduation. If you track Scout or Cobras, which I was dual track, I went to the Scout, flew that, and then went on after graduation and went the Scout, the Cobra track. So, yeah.
So were they using Hueys? So they used them for instruments. Did they have like a equivalent of BWS or basic warfighter skills type of thing at the time? No.
There was very little, any type of like air assault training, those types of things, they expected you to get that in the units. That's why I think flight school was a little shorter back then. 9 months was about it. Now it's, yeah.
Now, kind of when you left flight school, or I'll say, you've come out of flight school, you're qualified in your airframes. What was your first duty station, or what was that experience like for you?
Yeah. First of all, it was, you're a W-1 come into the unit, which, again, there's a lot of Vietnam Cobra guys flying in my unit. Went to Carson, A Company, 4th Aviation Battalion, and we had the S models. We had the prods, the production models, just different guns. It had the 7.62 and the 20 millimeter chunkers. The Cav had still the round canopy Cobras, but it had the 20 millimeter cannon under it. So that was the Cav unit. But it was a hoot, a lot of fun. And for me to get signed off as and NVGs were in their infancy back then. We went to flight school, they were full face, and you could just look through the tubes. There's no depth perception. And then it went away to the cutaways. And then, so here, in fact, I have a friend coming in next week from Idaho, and he and I were 2 W-1s out there, less than 200 hours in helicopters, and they give you a Cobra and tell you to go out and fly goggles. We're out flying at 2 a.m. Back then, you couldn't fly goggles anytime. It had to be with the moon cycle. So that was, and also we had the Alpha model 58s, which were kind of weak. Then they went to the Charlie model, which went a little bit more horsepower in the engine, went from a C-18 engine to a C-20 engine. I think maybe they lengthened the tail rotor blades, but I wasn't a 58 guy back then, so I'm not sure all the details. But those aircraft were pretty weak when we would follow them around doing the true attack roll where the Scout would go out. We would follow the Scout, and we would land, usually go to idle, and then the Scout go out and do the observation. It was truly preparing for that Russian attack through the folded gap in in Europe. That was the premise for most of our training, was to prepare you for that. So tow mills were the hot ticket for the day. That was, of course, pre-Hellfire, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and so in 1985, from my understanding, is when you transitioned over to the Reserve National Guard component. Can you talk a little bit about what made you really want to execute that transition, and kind of what led you to make the decision to move off of active duty and into that role?
Yeah, I had applied for the 160th. They were very new and very young, and they said, no, you have to stay at Fort Carson, finish your 4-year tour there, and then go to the advanced course. That was the next, and then you can come apply with us. So I was just kind of put off by that. And we didn't have a lot of money for training. Fort Bragg had a lot of money. You're out flying your butts off all the time, every day, day in, day out. Where at Fort Carson, we flew the desk a lot. So I was a little set back by the amount of flying we were doing, and just wanted to be a pilot in my career, not so much a soldier. So made the decision to get out and move back home to Louisiana. And my brother was into crop dusting. I dabbled in that a little bit in the fixed wings, and then started flying offshore and kind of took my civilian career. But back then, Nick, the phase out and go from the reserve to the guard component probably after Desert Storm. And then clearly after 9/11, the reserve, they just I don't know that they have any assets anymore. But used to, the reserves were very competitive with the number of aircraft they had with the Guard. I mean, they had Apache units in Texas, Apache battalion up in Kentucky. They had Chinook units around. So it was quite a different complexion back then with the Guard and Reserve.
Something that stood out to me, and you could probably elaborate a little bit more on it. I know in 1986, about a year after you transitioned to the Reserve Guard component, you deployed to Panama, the Canal Zone in Panama for a medevac mission. Yeah. And just for our listeners, in terms of a lot of people associate, the 80s Panama Operation Just Cause. This was, 3 to 4 years prior to Operation Just Cause. But what was the landscape like of that particular operation and that call to service on the deployment? And kind of, you probably have a unique perspective on where it was when you were down there, opposed to where it was going just a few years later.
Yeah, we were actually, the National Guard was tasked with building roads out in help build the infrastructure out in the boonies, so to speak. Most of the metropolitan areas over on the Pacific side in Panama City, that's where the U.S. Army hospital was. There was an Air Force base there. So we were over on the Cologne side. So we would go out during the day and support the engineers that were out there with bulldozers, et cetera. And we would land. And if anybody got hurt, we would fly them into Panama City for any medevac services. So it was kind of cool. One night we got weathered in and had to stay in the back of the helicopter. Again, these little nuggets of information through your career that you think about going back to. And here we are, 4 guys sleeping in a helicopter out in the middle of nowhere because they didn't have room in the tents. And we woke up the next morning and there were actual paw prints around the helicopter, around the Huey. And they were, a puma or something had been kind of sniffing around the helicopter at night. We were like, holy smoke, I'm glad we didn't leave the doors open, but it was a neat mission. And flying along the canal, of course, was very memorable for me. It was, and we did get a chance to ride in the train from one side of the country to the other.
This is not really necessarily related to aviation, but more so just because I wouldn't say that I'm well educated on that. What was the political landscape like of Americans being in Panama at the time, just, given to the shift where, the invasion of Panama happened, just several years later? I guess even for me, I just don't know much about it. And it's confusing to me because I just don't know how the socio-political type of standing was.
When we would get a day or two off and get a chance to go down on the community and just deal with the population, everybody was friendly except the police and paramilitary folks. You could tell we were not welcome. It was just one of those feelings. Of course, we're unarmed. We can't carry weapons, but they've got these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids going around with fully automatic weapons. So it was a little intimidating. One thing that was kind of neat back then as well, we had a FARC set up just north of Cologne. And this was when Nicaragua was kind of a hot spot. So back then, this was, and I didn't know it at the time, but, it was the 160th. They would land in there with the Blackhawks, and they were going north. They were headed out towards Nicaragua from Panama. So it was like, oh, it kind of clicked, like, who are these guys in here? Yeah. And then all of a sudden you start putting 2 and 2 together. It's like, oh, they're going in to support the Sandinistas. So, yeah, interesting.
Which, for our listeners, if you want to learn more than that, just Google Iran-Contra, and you can learn all that you want to learn about that whole the whole thing around that. Kind of looking a little bit further, both at your civilian and military experience. Obviously, your military career extended decades beyond that, and you grew. And we'll talk a little bit more. But I do kind of want to, at least for a minute, shift gears and talk a little bit about the civilian side and how you kind of grew your career on the civilian side. Obviously, you mentioned you flew a little bit of offshore stuff for the Gulf, off the Gulf of Mexico for the oil industry. Yeah. Where did you, I saw initially on your resume that you kind of flew some charters in and around the New York City area. Kind of what made you decide to kind of shift from that and start exploring different areas of aviation? Yeah.
To be brutally honest, Nick, it was really about putting food on the table. I had a young son, young married couple. I had to get a job. So I worked offshore for a year, technically got laid off. It was a numbers game. They were laying people off, and I was like number 98 from the bottom of the seniority list. They finally got to me. You kind of see it coming. So I flew out there for about a year, which was interesting. This was pre-GPS days. There were a few aircraft that had LORAN-Cs, which was an old, precursor to GPS. But other than that, you carried a map, and you just, it was dead reckoning and navigation. So that was a little bit of a challenge flying offshore. Weather was a big challenge out there. My first time to go truly inadvertent IMC, I was by myself. Fortunately, I had in the National Guard and Reserve, I had a superb instructor pilot who focused on that just the week before: attitude, heading, torque, airspeed. I punched in inadvertent IMC. Okay, here I am. Let's stay level. I knew I was high enough. I'm not going to hit anything offshore. Did a slow, gradual turn back out towards the coast, and in 2 minutes I was out of it. But usually that first 2 minutes is what kills somebody that is not prepared for it. So fortunately, just a couple of weeks before that, I had drill, and we'd focused on that inadvertent IMC. So that probably potentially saved my life. But did that, and then when I got laid off, a gentleman that I was stationed at Fort Carson with was the chief pilot for I think we had 14 helicopters just north of Philadelphia near Allentown, and we supported in and out of New York City, mainly jet rangers, long rangers. We had a Bell 222, and it was a cool mission for a young guy to do, flying in and out of New York City. Nighttime, you come around the south side of Manhattan and you look up at night, it's just breathtaking to look up, all the lights in Manhattan, and landing some of the heliports around the city there. Just pretty cool. And we did a lot of celebrity, I'll say sports celebrities from the day: Mario Andretti, all types of Roger Penske, of course, probably one of the most well-known guys in that space, the cars. And I had a chance to ride in a car with Jackie Stewart. We flew him around. He was promoting a book. Oh, cool. So a lot of that type of flying, it was cool, but it was, 5, 6, 7 days a week, long days, and but neat stuff. But then I had a call to go back to close to my home, to fly for a utility company in 1987, I guess that was. And I spent the next 10 years there, mainly flying power line patrol. But since I had fixed wing flying as well, I started flying a Baron and then a King Air and then a Citation. So my fixed wing kind of evolved, but I flew the Jet Ranger on power line patrol and the S-76 on executive transport in and out of New Orleans. So that was always cool, going down there, landing at the Superdome. We routinely would go to New Orleans once or twice a week, which helped me later during Katrina, because I knew New Orleans like the back of my hand. I'd flown helicopters there in and around there for 10 plus years. So when Katrina hit and we deployed there, I felt right at home, so.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue, because I'd like to talk a little bit, obviously you were still doing the National Guard side while this was going on. And do you mind talking a little bit about the RAID program and how that came to fruition and kind of the early days of that program and what it was like and what you guys were doing?
Yeah, I started flying that probably in 98, reconnaissance and interdiction detachment. It was a way that the drug problem was very bad, and it was hard and I had moved to North Carolina in 97. So I was in North Carolina, and it was a way for the federal government to aid local municipalities that didn't have the funding, didn't have the deep pockets to buy their own helicopter. So we were able, as a federal agency, we flew mainly local police departments, counties, their drug agencies, folks around. But we did fly, had a chance to fly DEA, Customs, FBI on the larger, bigger missions. And the aircraft was a 58. They called it an A+. It was A airframe with the A+ engine. But we had FLIR. And so one pilot, the pilot in the right seat would normally fly with goggles, and the pilot in the left seat would be tracking a vehicle with the FLIR. And you'd usually have an agent in the back. We had radios to communicate with the folks on the ground. A lot of times you'd be doing work with an undercover agent, and they would go in Applebee's, and they're sitting there ordering. You're flying overhead at 3,000 feet, just orbiting around and around and around. And you're sitting there listening to what they're ordering, and then they'll talk about a drug deal, and then they'll talk about, how your fries, some ketchup. Oh, it was just crazy, kind of odd. And it was kind of neat to see what the, I think the statute of limitations has passed now. But for us to be able to, when you'd get a vehicle in traffic, it was always hard to follow a vehicle in traffic because of the lights. You get mixed up, and you didn't want to make the blades pop, so you were flying at a certain speed. And then when they would slow down, you would try to do some S-turns. But one thing that the agents would do, I won't name an agency, they had little hand drills, battery-operated hand drills that you would have at your home doing a DIY project, and they would drill 2 or 3 holes in the top of the brake lights of the bad guy, right? And that way, when he was in traffic, under goggles, those lights just lit up. It was no way to lose them. So they would sit there and lean on the back of the brake lights and drill a couple of holes in them. And so it was kind of a neat way to track the vehicles. And it was interesting for a guard guy to get involved in that kind of mission where, occasionally, it was rare, but occasionally there'd be a shooting, so you're flying around overhead, and the agent on the ground is, running the operation. And like you had been in the military, I've heard some ass chewings before, but I've never heard one like the night that a federal agency officer, a senior guy, chewed one of his guys out because he told him over the radio, he said, take the bad guy out. And he didn't take him out. Yeah. And so it was like, oh, this is not good. So when we got back to the airport during the debrief, it was like a good drill sergeant ass chewing.
Yeah. Now, I think it's interesting too. You mentioned you moved back to North Carolina, and in reading through kind of your history, I immediately recognized Duke Progress Energy. They're still the prevalent energy company there today, and you were still there actually when I had moved to North Carolina. Do you want to talk a little bit about your pathway into becoming the managing director for their program, and a little bit about what you guys did there?
Absolutely. I'll take you back just a minute, back to when I was at Entergy Corporation, flew out of Jackson, Mississippi. The number 2 person at Entergy was going to move to North Carolina to become the CEO of Carolina Power and Light. Well, he took several people with him, probably, I don't know, I'm going to say a dozen, maybe 15 people. He took his chief financial officer, chief legal officer, but he asked 2 of the pilots that flew him a lot, said, why don't y'all come go with me and let's start a flight department. So we moved up there in 97 and started from scratch, bought, older Citation, things evolved, went through a couple of mergers. We merged with Florida Progress in, I guess, 99 or 2000. That's when we picked up more of the international mission. We got the Falcon 2000. And so I moved from chief pilot to the director in probably 2004, and mainly a regional utility, the Carolinas and Florida, North and South Carolina and Florida, a little bit into Virginia. But then of course, I'll come back to this piece. I did deploy in 08, 09 to Iraq. But besides that, with my civilian flying, we merged with Duke out of Charlotte in 2012. In July was completed, but we knew it was coming, say, from late 2010. So it took about a year and a half for that to evolve. And that was not very pretty. It was ugly on both sides. We were the smaller of the companies. I was fortunate enough to be chosen to be the director and lead the flight department after the merger. And again, a lot of the people didn't want me to be there that worked for me. And that's tough. You know,
Yeah.
it's a tough position. Fortunately, I had some very strong pilots that, you know, kind of put their foot down with some of the other guys and said, look, David's trustworthy. He's honest. He's going to give you a good shot. Let's just do this. So had some good people. In fact, I had a couple of guys that flew 160th with, that flew for me, and they were just good, solid guys. You know, I can't say enough good about them.
Well, and that's a huge testament to your character too. When you have solid guys or regular guys, any people aside, when people are willing to stand in your corner and vouch for you and speak to your professionalism and work ethic and, you know, promote you being there. I think that's a big testament to you. Talking, you know, before I do want to talk a little bit about your 2008 and 2009 deployment to Iraq, but before we do, when you moved to North Carolina, did you also transition to the North Carolina National Guard, or did you remain?
For about a year, I maintained my currency in Mississippi. Great guys there in Jackson. In fact, we had just gotten our UH-60, so I didn't go to the transition until probably early 98, I think it was. And the UH-60s that the Mississippi Guard got back then were hand-me-downs from the 160th. Technically, the first 60 I got qualified on, besides school, was an MH-60.
Oh, wow.
They were leftovers from the 160th. So, again, the avionics were non-standard, so it was a little bit of a challenge for a lot of guys, and they were kind of ragged out. You know, the 160th flies hard. They run the aircraft hard. So it took a few years for the guys to get them in good shape there in Mississippi. You know, testimony to the good maintenance staff there, but took a few years. But yes, I did transition to the North Carolina Guard. That was probably 97, 98 timeframe.
So the reason that I wanted to kind of make that point specifically was in 2005, when you guys went down to New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. I would imagine that put you in a unique experience or a unique position, given that that's your home area. You know, that's your area. I would imagine probably not very many people that you went with had the experience or knowledge of flying down there that you did. And how did your role kind of develop for that operation, given that you'd flown there before?
Yeah, and we were flying the raid aircraft, which we took a counter drug aircraft that had specific capabilities, night vision, FLIR, et cetera. And so we weren't in a life-saving mission. We were more of a security role. So when we got there, it was kind of interesting, Nick, because, you know, we briefed up local sheriff's department, police, and it was very unusual for a stateside aircraft to get a guy climb into the back, two guys, one on each side of the 58 with the doors off, and both of them have locked and loaded M16s, you know, and it was very strange to see that. And I know there are other people who have experiences seeing that. Nobody ever shot from my aircraft. I'm not going to say that, but we did land. We routinely landed in Walmart parking lots and in on streets, et cetera. So that was kind of a cool mission to be able to do that. And with me knowing New Orleans like I did, it was definitely an asset. But we briefed up with police, and they actually found that the bad guys that we were tracking down that were going in and stealing, when they would interview them, they said that they knew that it was just going to be carte blanche at the end of this storm, that they were going to be able to go into all the nice homes on St. Charles and all these beautiful places and steal from them. So interesting times for sure.
I agree with that, especially from an outside perspective. When until today, I truly didn't know. I definitely fall into the category of people who had seen the Hurricane Katrina stuff from both the Army side and the Coast Guard side, purely from the lift platform aspect, and more so like the SAR roles that people fell into. And most of even the video that I've seen, it's all, the search and rescue mission. There's very little shown or talk about the security aspect that coexisted at that same time frame, and the aviation component that was involved there, other than some individual experiences from people who flew there talking about just the multi-agency nightmare that was the airspace. But they, very rarely do people dive into just how complex it was and all of the different mission sets going on. So I think it's really awesome. And it's definitely something that I didn't know existed, but it sounds like it was both hectic and pretty amazing to be part of at the same time.
Yeah, there were some government facilities around the area that rocket industry, that were considered, I guess, national assets that we didn't want to lose. So we actually flew guys that were, I don't know what brand they were, but they were definitely active duty SF guys, right. Whether or not they were Delta, Green Beret, either way. But we flew some of them in and out of some of these remote places, and we would take food to them, and they hung out there for several days because it was we stopped in Slidell, which is on the north side of the lake, and spent the first night or two there. Of course, no power, and so you're just kind of taking a bath with wet wipes for the first couple of days, and then we moved down to Belle Chase, and that was where we got integrated with all the other services. And again, we flew mostly at night, but 2 or 3 in the morning, it was kind of crazy to have fixed wing aircraft flying overhead. And they would say you had the airspace, we would have, let's say 500 feet and below, and they would have 500 to, 2,000 or whatever their upper limit was. But they were spraying for mosquitoes because mosquito was going to be a big deal. So, you see these, I think they were C-130s, civilian C-130s that are flying around New Orleans with spray rigs on them. I'm like, wow. Where do these guys come from? So it's, and you're sitting there talking to them, it was very much like a combat zone where you have a overarching controlling agency, whether or not it was a Navy aircraft or an Air Force aircraft. I didn't know, but they would have control. They'd say, okay, this corridor, we're going to have fixed wing assets at, 1,500 feet working for the next 30 minutes. So
now kind of fast forwarding a little bit to 2008, 2009, talking just while we're on the subject of, the military component of your career. Just to kind of give our listeners an idea, what rank were you on that deployment? Like, were you a W4 at that point?
I was a 5. I'd been promoted to W5. I was a safety officer.
Okay.
Even though I'd been an instructor pilot in the Huey years ago, I deployed as a brigade level safety guy. So with the North Carolina National Guard, we had a brigade headquarters that moved. We didn't have assets under us from North Carolina. We had Ohio National Guard, we had New York National Guard, and we had a couple of active duty components under us as well.
Do you mind talking a little bit about that deployment in terms of your flight experiences and what the landscape was like in 08, 09 in Iraq?
It had toned down. I don't think it was near what it was even a year before that with the in the 07 time frame. As a senior guy, as a W5, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't the one that was out there doing the real combat assault missions, the tough duties. Those were the younger guys. But I did get a chance to fly enough. And honestly, I probably flew more on VIP missions to have a gray-haired, I was 50 years old. So, I was a real senior guy. And I felt real comfortable. I would go down and fly with, let's say, the New York National Guard or the Ohio National Guard. They were much better operating the aircraft than I was. The physical part of flying the aircraft, I could wiggle the sticks, but they were very good with it and very accommodating of me as being the old guy that would just come out and fly once every week and a half or so. Some great guys.
Now, where were you out of at that time?
We started out probably the first 3 or 4 months we were out of Baghdad. Then we moved down to Talil. We actually built, as a safety guy, I was on a team. We built a big FARP there at Talil that was needed. And then we moved up to Balad for our last probably 3 or 4 months. So we were moved around in those three locations, but we were at Balad, our trip home. And again, I flew a lot of VIP stuff where we would fly the ambassador to Iraq or something like that. And so I had a lot of the easy flights, honestly, compared to a lot of what the younger guys flew. But nonetheless, we had probably my biggest challenge was, flying with a young W2. And here I am, an old W5, making sure that he knew he was in charge, but I may give him some insight. In fact, one day we were flying, we actually had an 06 and a couple of W5s in our aircraft. And it was a brigade commander from another aviation brigade we were tasked to fly. I was in the lead aircraft with a young guy, great guy, and a friend of mine, Jeff, was in the aircraft behind us. And you're in this sandstorm, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And finally, Chalk 2 says, I lost sight of you. That's the worst thing you want to hear is like, oh, no, what's happened? So over the next 30 seconds, we decided, with a quick call, we knew it was clear at about 4,000 feet. So we made the decision. I said, I can do this. I can punch in and fly. I know that. So if you handle the control, the radios, we'll get this done. So we punched in, told the Chalk 2 what we were doing. We're climbing out of 2,000 feet, heading whatever, 270. We're 35 miles from destination, and they made the same call outs. They were about 2 miles behind us. We punched out on top, and everybody's leaning out the door, including this brigade commander, waiting for Chalk 2 to pop out. And he pops out and joins up with us, VFR on top, for the next 20 miles where it was clear. So, those were harrowing times, but I think a combination in the cockpit of having somebody a little calming and then somebody that can actually manage the flight as the young W2 or W3. So it was a good combination, good results, that's for sure.
As somebody who's been in pretty much that identical situation minus the sandstorm piece, I think it's always it's almost eerily calming when you have a very quiet, reserved W5 in the seat next to you who may be like, yeah, no, you're the PC and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, am I really though? You're like, they've got more flight hours than you've been alive. And, it's just, it's calming, but it's also one of those eerily strange situations for a while. It's different if they're talkative, but something about UW5s tend to be pretty quiet a lot of times and very reserved. But then it's like 2 clicks of a button and the day is saved. It's fun. It's funny. But that's really awesome. Now on that deployment, were you guys primarily flying 60s then?
Yes, we had, I think, about 3,000 people, a brigade under us, and 124 aircraft, if I remember the number. We actually had a couple of C-130s. We had some C-23s, the Sherpas. We had some UC-12s, UC-35s, but mainly Hawks, some Apaches, and some Chinooks. So it was kind of a more traditional brigade plus.
Okay. And kind of coming back from that deployment, this is a little bit more of a broader spectrum question. Just how did you feel, at the same time, you're the managing director of Duke Progress Energy for their aviation department. You're a W5 with the National Guard component actively deploying. Obviously, you still have your job back home. How was that work balance between these two similar but very different career fields? And how did you kind of go about managing proficiency in both and excelling in both? What did that process look like for you?
Well, first of all, I had a superb chief pilot that worked for me and who managed while I was gone, because there's not only that, 365-day window, you have at least 3 months, maybe 4 or 5 months building up, and then a month or two afterwards. So it was quite a window. So I took myself off the flight schedule at my civilian job, probably 6 months out prior to my deployment, and just said, I'll spool back up when I get back. And so it's the same thing when I came back. Let's just get you back to work a couple of months, and then we'll get you off to school, let you fly right seat, SIC. So it was very deliberate, I guess, as a word, Nick. Right. Also, right at the tail end of my transitioning back, I went to the UH-72, so that helped kind of detox me, get the sand out of my shorts, so to speak, and get back acclimated to, the civilian world.
Now, you were at Duke Energy Progress until 2014.
Correct.
And you had retired as a Chief Warrant Officer 5 from the Guard in 2013. When you left the Guard and were kind of looking at, Was it around the time that you left the Guard that you were making a decision on, hey, where do I want to be? Do I want to stay here in North Carolina? Do I want to go elsewhere? What was your decision-making process like as you left the Guard and kind of transitioned from Duke Energy to your next steps?
Yeah, well, I left the Guard I think I was probably at age 56, 57, right in that. And I probably would have stayed until 60, but the job from that very demanding merger from, say, 2011 is kind of when it started. It was consummated in 12, 13, and 14. It was nothing short of ugly during those next couple of years. And so I was trying to make my civilian job work. So I probably left the Guard a couple of years before I really wanted to, but I made that decision. And then I left in 2014. Technically, I retired, but I was in a very uncomfortable situation there. So it was time for me to leave. I'd gotten two years downstream from the merger. I'd gotten my team in place. Anybody that needed to move from Raleigh to Charlotte was moved. Their family wasn't good. I could sit there and go, because a lot of my leadership made it very uncomfortable for me. Yeah, so
that's respectable, and I think that says a lot. That I think that people as a whole in any career field have a lot of difficulty identifying that and acting upon making a decision to separate themselves from that. But I do think maybe potentially the higher up or the higher position you are, maybe the little bit easier that decision is to make because you're actively part of that decision-making process or you're not, which is, part of potentially why people would leave. What made you choose Tennessee and your next steps from there?
Well, this is going to sound a little strange, but it was a headhunter that had reached out to me and said, and that knew me. She knew what I'd gone through at Duke during that 2 years. And she said, if anybody can fix the problems there and make that work, I've got a job for you in Tennessee. It was a job where they had just fired a director and a chief pilot at the same time for inappropriate things. And so I went in, and so they jokingly, kind of tongue in cheek, called me the fixer. So I went there for about 2 years, kind of got them up and running. And then the same thing, a headhunter. I was really ready to retire then, and took a job in Georgia for about a year, and really thought I was done flying. My career was going to wind down. That was going to be my exit. But in 2016, TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, had a fatal helicopter accident in Kentucky. It was unfortunate. So within the next 6 months or so, they knew they had an internal problem. So the CEO, he was somebody that I knew from back in North Carolina I'd known him for at least 15 plus years. He was a CEO. And so when I got a call from him that said, would you come up here and help us? I said, okay, I'll come up. I'll give you 5 years. This is kind of what I need, some latitude. We need to merge departments, blah, blah, blah. So got that authority and worked another 5 years. But I was ready to really bail at 60. But I said, I'll give you 5 more years and work to 65. And that's where I met Spencer. So, yeah. But,
I've heard some great stories, all great things. Something, it might seem like a little bit of an off the wall question, and it could have just been that perhaps it never really presented itself, but obviously looking through and talking through all of your experience, something that is not present on the civilian side that for me, just through a lot of the people that we've talked to is maybe somewhat surprising is that you never decided to go down the helicopter EMS route. Was that something that was very intentional or just kind of by happenstance of the career paths that you ended up, or the opportunities that you end up pursuing?
I think it's more of the latter of those two, Nick. I was probably, I thought about it because I was a medevac,
right.
IPSP, and always thought that it may be something for me, but for whatever reason, the leadership opportunities that I was afforded to move to North Carolina and become a chief pilot. Then once I did that, the floodgates kind of opened and I was beyond it. But prior to that, yes, it was absolutely. And in fact, honestly, and I'm an old guy at 66. I've considered it, because I think I'm still employable to a certain degree. And so I could add some value some places. And so I thought, maybe I'll do EMS for a few years. I haven't pursued it, but it's something that would fit in my wheelhouse. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And something that we kind of do, and I hate that Spencer's having a little bit of technical difficulties here, because I'm sure that he would have some stuff as well. But something that we typically do in every episode, and actually we've had every single guest on the show kind of give a little bit of insight in different ways. But the way that I'll pose the question to you specifically with your background and kind of in what you've done throughout your career and your life, what kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to make a, kind of the dual career track and be successful in the civilian world, not just, necessarily as a pilot in the civilian world, but whatever career field they may be in the civilian world, while also maintaining and pursuing a full, lifelong career in the Guard? What type of advice would you give to that person to be successful in both realms?
Yeah, I think number one is immerse yourself in whatever that path is. I was told that by a former chief pilot that I worked for, and he talked about that, being immersed all the time, not just randomly, but being committed, being clear understanding of expectations. And I'll say that mainly from a manager's standpoint. But when you have a new pilot come in the hiring process, I think laying out expectations early on, this is what I expect of you, and ask the question, what do you expect of me? And I think that goes both ways. Whatever side of the table you're on when you're making those decisions, do I go fly for this company? And if those expectations aren't clear, I'd probably look elsewhere, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges people have in the workplace. My son is a friend of mine, and we talk about work, and I think about having clear expectations of what he or she may want, your boss, and then what you can provide there. So clear expectations.
Absolutely. And that's great advice, especially to, I think that goes for both civilian and military in general. And I think that, without diving down a rabbit hole, I think that if any of our listeners are perhaps a junior officer or even a, young NCO or wherever you might be in your career, a lot of times we breeze over quarterly counselings, or they may never happen. But I think especially as you grow in your career in the military and you become a tracked officer, sitting down with, whether that is, the company SP, even though he's not your on paper boss, but,
chain of command, sure.
Your leadership, whether that's your commander, battalion commander, platoon leader, whoever it might be, in very black and white terms, asking, what are your expectations of me? Because a lot of times I think that we tend to get very cookie cutter things given to us. And I think that that's because they don't expect you to ask those questions proactively. And I think by doing that and heeding that advice, it really helps us develop, because if we don't have that direction from the people who've been there, done that, especially, when you're talking an SP, a battalion commander, or a brigade or battalion SP, even, those, or battalion AMSO in my situation, whatever it might be, they've kind of been there, done that, and they know your tools to success. So their expectation is that you're going to execute those footsteps to meet those, gateways for success. So I really appreciate that advice. I think it's great. And I hope that, our listeners are able to take that and apply it to wherever they are, regardless of if you're, a shelver or a stalker at Walmart, or if you're, flying Blackhawks, whatever it might be.
David, I really appreciate you coming on, man. It's been a blast to get to see you and listen to some of your stories that I hadn't heard before. I apologize for some of my technical difficulties, but I know that hopefully Nick's able to salvage some of the value and wisdom that you brought to not just us, but our audience as well. So thanks again, man.
Absolutely. My pleasure. You guys are great. I love what you're doing with Battalion. I've, of course, ordered things from you and try to promote you when I can. So you're doing great things. Congratulations on what you're doing.
Thank you.
We'll make sure we send you a Sluts t-shirt here pretty soon. So.
I love that. I've got a sticker up on my toolbox. Everybody, what is that? Oh, Sluts. That's good stuff. Fun stuff.
Absolutely. Well, David, thank you so much. And we can't wait to have you back on.
Good. Thanks, guys. And look forward to having a brew with you someday soon.